It was almost midnight when 3 knocks echoed against a door that hadn't opened for anyone in 14 years. Outside, soaked to the bone, a 31-year-old woman held her 8-month pregnant belly and prayed that someone would hear her. Inside, a man who had buried his own heart alongside his wife hesitated with his hand on the doorknob, every instinct telling him not to open it, not to let the world back in. He didn't know that on the other side of that old wooden door stood the family life had denied him. She didn't know that this would be the last door she'd ever have to knock on. And neither of them imagined that on that stormy night, 2 lonely souls were about to save each other. This is the story of how one simple act of kindness, opening a door in the rain, changed forever the lives of 2 people the world had thrown away. Before we continue, tell me in the comments what town you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain fell like the sky had decided to empty out, all at once, every ounce of grief the world had been holding back. Grace could barely make out the gravel road winding through the hills of eastern Tennessee, but she kept walking anyway. One hand braced under her swollen belly, the other shielding her eyes from the water that came down without mercy. Her legs were heavy, exhausted, and every step felt like a prayer that the next one wouldn't be her last. That's when, through the curtain of rain, she saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance, a lit window in the middle of nowhere. She didn't think. She couldn't think anymore. She just ran as much as her body would let her, climbed 3 rain-slicked wooden steps onto an old farmhouse porch, and pounded on the door with a closed fist. Once, twice, 3 times, while the wind howled and the baby shifted inside her, as if it too were begging for shelter. On the other side of that door, Walter Callahan sat in his usual armchair, his old dog stretched out at his feet, a cup of cold coffee forgotten on the side table. It had been 14 years since anyone had knocked on that door after dark. 14 years since he'd expected anybody, since he'd missed anyone who might still come back. When those 3 knocks echoed through the silent house, his heart jumped in a way he didn't know it still could. He rose slowly, his knee cracking, and made his way to the door, his hand hovering over the worn brass knob, hesitating. Part of him, the part that had padlocked his heart for over a decade, whispered not to open it, not to let the world in again. But the rain outside was too violent, and there was a desperation in that knocking he recognized all too well. He opened the door, and what he saw on the other side hollowed out what little was left of his hardened chest. A young woman, drenched from her hair to her boots, shaking from the cold, with a pregnant belly that left no doubt how close she was to having that baby. Her eyes, wide and frightened, met his for a fraction of a second before her knees buckled and she caught herself against the doorframe to keep from falling. Walter stood frozen for a moment that felt like it lasted a lifetime. It had been so long since he'd seen another living soul step into his world that for a second he genuinely didn't know what to do with his hands, his voice, his own body. But then the young woman let out a low moan, pressed her hand to her belly, and the instinct he thought had died years ago came roaring back in an instant. Come in before you catch your death out there," he said, his voice rough from days without speaking to a soul. He took her arm with a gentleness that surprised even himself and pulled her inside, pushing the door shut against the wind that kept trying to follow them in. The house smelled of wood smoke and old coffee, of aged pine and years of solitude. Walter settled her into his own armchair, the only comfortable one left in the whole house, and hurried off, as fast as a 51-year-old man with a bad knee could hurry, to fetch a towel and a blanket. Meanwhile, his old dog, a grey-muzzled hound named Duke, ambled over to the visitor and rested his snout on her knee, as if he understood, in the way only animals do, that this person needed every ounce of comfort the world had left to give. Grace, still trembling, ran a shaking hand over the dog's head and felt for the first time in days that maybe she wasn't going to die alone on some backcountry road. "Thank you," she managed, her teeth chattering. "I didn't know where else to go. I saw the light and—" Her voice broke, swallowed by a sob she tried to hold in and couldn't. Walter came back with the blanket, draped it over her shoulders without ceremony, and looked away, uncomfortable with the closeness of someone else's emotion. Someone else's emotion. He'd forgotten how to sit with that. "No need to thank me," he muttered. "No decent person leaves somebody out in a storm like that, especially not somebody in your condition." He gestured awkwardly toward her belly, and Grace, despite everything, almost laughed at how clumsy the gesture was. He went to the kitchen, lit the old wood stove, and set a pot of milk to warm. His hands, calloused from decades of working the land, trembled slightly, not from cold but from something he couldn't quite name. There was a person in his house, a living, breathing person who needed him. That simple fact, ordinary to anyone else, was to Walter a quiet revolution, shaking the foundations of everything he'd spent 14 years building around himself. The walls, the silence, the certainty that he was better off alone. He glanced through the kitchen doorway into the living room, saw the young woman wrapped in the blanket with the dog at her feet, and felt something shift in his chest, something that ached and warmed him all at once. He stood watching the milk heat without really seeing it, lost in a memory of another time when that same kitchen had been full of life. When he returned with the mug of warm milk and a leftover biscuit from breakfast, Grace had stopped shaking. She took the mug with both hands gratefully and sipped slowly, feeling the warmth travel down her throat and spread through her body. Walter sat down in a wooden chair a respectful distance away, unsure what to say. The two of them sat in silence for a while, only the crackling of the fire and the sound of rain outside filling the space. It was a strange silence, not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. The silence of two people life had pushed to the edges, meeting for the first time on the brink of the same abyss. "You got somewhere to go?" he finally asked, breaking the quiet with the gentleness of a man who already suspects the answer. Grace lowered her eyes to the mug and took her time answering, letting the silence say what words still couldn't. When she lifted her face again, her eyes were wet. "No," she said, plain and stripped of hope. "I don't have anywhere to go. I don't have anybody." And in that word, anybody, Walter recognized the echo of his own life, and he knew, even without wanting to admit it, that this stormy night had changed something he'd believed was impossible to change. That first night, Walter gave up his own bedroom for Grace and slept in the living room chair with Duke at his feet. Or rather, he tried to sleep because he spent most of the night awake, listening to the soft footsteps of the young woman settling into the bed. Her breathing through the thin wall, thinking, without meaning to, about how strange it was to have another soul living under his roof. He had grown so used to absence that presence now felt almost like a dream. At one point he heard her crying softly on the other side of the wall, a muffled cry, the kind of someone who'd already learned to weep without making a sound, and he wanted to get up, to say something. But what would a man like him say? He stayed still, staring at the ceiling in the dark, praying in his own clumsy way that the girl might find a little peace that night. When the sun broke through the clouds the next morning, spilling golden, clean light over the cornfields, the kind of light that only exists after a great storm, Grace woke up disoriented, taking a few seconds to remember where she was. The room was simple, a room built for a man living alone. A bed, an old dresser, a single photograph on top of it, a woman with a beautiful smile in a floral dress, looking at the camera with a tenderness that reached across the years. Grace looked at that photo and understood, without needing to be told, that this house carried its own losses too. She got up carefully, hands braced against her belly, and followed the smell of fresh coffee into the kitchen. She found Walter already dressed for the fields, boots by the door, a worn straw hat hanging on a nail on the wall. He glanced at her, a little shy. "Morning," he murmured. "Coffee's on. Eggs too if you want some. You're welcome to stay. I mean, long as you need. I'm in no hurry to put anybody out." Grace felt her eyes burn again. It had been days since anyone had spoken to her without wanting something in return. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. I promise I won't be any trouble. Soon as the baby comes, I'll figure something out. Walter raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "One thing at a time, ma'am. One thing at a time." And so it went. That sunny morning after the storm, with the smell of coffee and wet earth drifting through the kitchen window, that two lonely lives began, without knowing it yet, to keep each other company. Walter went out to the fields, but that day he worked differently. For the first time in 14 years, there was somebody waiting for him back home, and though he wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, It changed the weight of every step he took over that red Tennessee clay. By mid-morning, he caught himself looking toward the house, wondering if the young woman had eaten properly, if she was doing all right, if the baby was moving the way it should, and he shook his head at himself, not quite understanding this sudden worry over someone he barely knew. The days that followed were made of small, quiet lessons. Grace, even with her belly enormous, couldn't stand still. She'd been raised to work, to make herself useful, and the idea of eating bread she hadn't earned troubled her deeply. So little by little, she began tending to a house that hadn't known a woman's touch in years. She swept the dust from forgotten corners, washed the yellowed curtains, aired out rooms that smelled of mildew, and stopped time. In a forgotten corner of the pantry, she found a nearly dead basil plant in a cracked pot and moved it to the kitchen windowsill, watering it carefully until days later, new green leaves began to sprout. Walter, coming home from the fields each evening, found the house a little more alive every day, and he didn't know if that unsettled him or made him glad. The truth was, it made him glad. He just wasn't ready to admit it yet. It was on one of those afternoons, while Grace was digging through an old trunk looking for cleaning rags, that she found a shoebox tied shut with twine. She didn't open it. She respected what wasn't hers. But when Walter came home and saw her holding it, his face changed instantly, shadowed by an old grief. "That was Margaret's," he said quietly, almost against his will. "My wife." Grace set the box back in the trunk with the care of someone handling something sacred. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go through your things," she said. Walter shook his head and sat down heavily in a chair. "It's all right. It's been 14 years. I should have put it somewhere better or given it away, I don't know, but you can't seem to let go of it, can you?" He looked off into nothing for a moment. "She died of a cancer that came on so fast, we barely had time to understand what was happening. We wanted kids, tried our whole marriage, never came. And right when we'd finally made peace with it just being the two of us, she went too. And then it was just me left." It was the first time in over a decade Walter had spoken those words out loud, and strangely enough, he'd said them to a stranger, a young woman who'd knocked on his door just days before. Maybe it was easier precisely because she was a stranger. Or maybe deep down she wasn't a stranger anymore. Grace sat in the chair beside him in silence, and after a while laid her hand over his calloused one. A simple gesture, human, from someone who understood grief without needing an explanation. "My trouble's kind of the opposite of yours," she said, her voice low. "I'm about to have a baby nobody wanted, from a man who disappeared the day he found out I was pregnant. My mother threw me out of the house when she found out, said I'd shamed the family. I stayed with a friend for a while, but her husband started looking at me in a way that made it impossible to stay. So I packed what little I had and started walking. Didn't know where I was going, just knew I had to get out of there." Walter listened to all of it in silence, his jaw tight with a quiet fury at a world that treated a pregnant, alone young woman that way. And when she finished, he did something he hadn't done in years. He turned his hand over and squeezed hers back. "Nobody's going to look at you wrong here," he said firmly. "And nobody's putting you out. Long as I've got breath in me, you've got a roof." Grace cried then, not trying to hold it back, and Walter, not knowing what to do with his own heart, simply sat there holding her hand, letting her cry out everything she needed to. Outside, the sun sank behind the ridgeline, painting the sky orange and pink. And inside that old farmhouse, two broken people began, very slowly, to mend each other. As the weeks passed, the initial awkwardness gave way to a routine full of small, quiet closeness. Grace discovered that Walter, beneath his tough shell, was a man of hidden tenderness, the kind life bruises so badly a person learns to hide it out of fear of getting hurt again. She noticed how he always left the best cut of meat on her plate, how he pretended not to care, but couldn't hide a smile when she told stories from her childhood. He discovered that the young woman had a warm, contagious laugh once she let herself use it, and that she cooked better than almost anyone with recipes her grandmother had taught her. One Saturday afternoon, Grace decided to make a pot of smothered chicken and dumplings, a dish that filled the house with a smell Walter hadn't caught since Margaret was alive. He walked in through the kitchen door, took in the air, and for a second his eyes welled with a sweet kind of longing. "This kitchen hasn't smelled like this in a long time," he said, his voice rough. Grace smiled, stirring the pot. "My grandmother used to say good food's the only thing that brings people together without needing a single word." That night they ate together at the kitchen table by lamplight and talked about nothing important. The cattle, the rain that was threatening to come back, the name Grace was thinking of giving the baby. Walter told her about being a boy helping his father at harvest time, about the stories the old ranch hands used to swap by the fire, about the first calf he ever learned to rope. Grace listened, enchanted, chin propped on her hand. And Walter, who had forgotten what it was like to have someone interested in his stories, found himself talking more than he had in years. Somewhere between one story and the next, he noticed he was laughing, really laughing with his whole body, in a way he'd forgotten he still knew how to do. After dinner, he noticed that Grace's shoes, an old worn pair of sneakers, the only ones she owned, had a sole coming loose. Without saying a word, he took the shoe out to the porch and spent the evening fixing it with cobbler's glue and a heavy needle by lantern light. When Grace woke the next morning, she found the sneakers sitting outside her bedroom door, mended, cleaned with new laces. She held that shoe in her hands and cried, because it had been a very long time since anyone had taken care of her without wanting something in return. It was around this time that the glances between them started lasting a second longer than they should have. A second longer when she handed him his coffee mug in the morning. A second longer when he helped her up out of the armchair, his steady hand under her arm. Neither one of them knew how to name it. They were two people life had taught not to expect tenderness, and now, suddenly, tenderness was hanging in the air between them, warm and terrifying. Walter caught himself thinking about the young woman all day out in the fields, imagining what she might be doing, whether she was all right, whether the baby was moving the way it should, and scolding himself for it. "Foolishness, Walter. You're pushing 52, she's 31, practically a girl. Quit being a fool, ridiculous old man." But the heart, stubborn as any heart, wouldn't listen to reason. Grace, for her part, felt something similarly confusing. She'd grown up surrounded by men who let her down, who took without giving, who vanished the moment things got hard. And here, on this quiet man's farm, she was finding something she'd never known. A steady, silent kind of care that asked for nothing. Walter fixed the leak in the roof over her bed without her having to ask. He kept firewood split and stacked by the stove so she wouldn't have to strain herself. He brought home little things from town whenever he went, a piece of candy, a piece of fruit, a skein of yarn, because he'd noticed she was knitting booties for the baby. Once he brought back a bottle of cheap lavender perfume wrapped in brown paper and handed it to her without meeting her eyes, mumbling only that it had been on sale. Grace kept that little bottle like it was the most precious thing in the world. They were small gestures, but stacked together they built an entire language of affection. And Grace, little by little, began to catch herself smiling at the sound of his boots coming up the porch steps in the evening. There was one room in the house that always stayed shut, a door at the end of the hallway that Walter never opened and that he always lowered his eyes to when he passed it. Grace noticed but never asked. She'd learned to respect other people's closed doors. So until one afternoon, just a few weeks before the baby was due, Walter stopped in front of that door with an old key in his hand and stood there, motionless, for a long time. Grace, sewing in the living room, watched it all in silence. She saw him take a deep breath, turn the key in the rusted lock and push open a door that groaned from years of disuse. Inside was a crib, a wooden crib, coated in dust, built with care over 14 years ago by a couple who dreamed of a child that never came. There was also a trunk full of baby clothes, never worn, yellowed with time, and a rocking chair in the corner. It was the room Margaret had prepared with all her love, hoping to finally get pregnant, a room that stood as a monument to a dream death had interrupted. Walter stood frozen in the doorway, and Grace saw his shoulders begin to shake. She set down her sewing, rose with effort, and walked over to stand beside him. She said nothing, just placed her hand on his back, and the two of them stood there together, looking into that room, a tomb of hope. "She got all this ready," Walter finally said, his voice breaking. "All this time I never had the heart to come in here, never mind take it apart, or give it away or anything. Just left it sitting here waiting on a baby that never came. He turned to Grace and his eyes were full of tears he wouldn't let fall. "But now there's a baby coming. Your baby. And I got to thinking, maybe Margaret would be happy to know this room's finally going to be used, that all the love she put into it wasn't wasted." Grace felt her chest tighten with an emotion almost too big to hold. "Walter," she whispered, "are you sure? This is sacred for you." He shook his head, and a sad, beautiful smile crossed his sun-worn face. "Never been more sure of anything in my life, ma'am." And then, together, they began cleaning the room. They wiped the dust from the crib, aired out the little clothes, washed the curtains. Walter fixed the rocking chair that creaked, sanded the wood with his own hands, waxed it until it shone like new. Grace sewed a new set of baby linens from scraps she gathered, and stitched an initial onto one of the bibs, though she still hadn't chosen a name, so she didn't yet know which letter it would be. Little by little, the room that had been a monument to loss became a nest of hope. And as they worked side by side, laughing now and then, exchanging glances that lasted longer and longer, the two of them came to understand, without words, without rushing, that life had somehow stitched their fates together on the very same thread. But it wasn't all peace. In the little town nearby, where Walter went once a week for supplies, tongues had started wagging. A young, pregnant woman living out at closed-off Walter Callahan's place, the widower nobody had laid eyes on in years. The gossip spread like brushfire through dry grass. At the feed store counter, in the checkout line at the grocery, outside church on Sunday mornings, the whispers spread. Is it his baby? Well, at his age. Poor Margaret must be turning over in her grave. He's taking advantage, that's what it is. Taking advantage of a young girl. Walter, who had always been a man of few friends and no patience for idle talk, heard all of it, and his blood boiled. But what stung worse than anything said about him was what they said about Grace. It was on one of those trips to town that he overheard two women whispering in line at the pharmacy about that girl who showed up out of nowhere, no telling what she was after, sinking her hooks into an older man just to have a place to stay. Walter, who'd had his back turned around slowly. He didn't shout, didn't make a scene. He just looked at the two of them with a calm that was more unsettling than any raised voice. "The young lady you two are talking about," he said, his voice low and steady, "is the most decent person I have ever met in my life. She is at my house because I offered her a roof over her head on a night of storm when the whole world, including her own mother, turned its back on her. If you ladies have that much time to spend on other people's business, maybe you'd be better served carrying a covered dish to someone who needs it instead of throwing stones at someone already down." And he walked out, leaving the two of them red-faced with shame. When he told Grace what happened that night, not out of pride but because he simply didn't know how to keep things from her, the young woman sat quiet for a long moment. Then, eyes wet, she said, "Nobody's ever stood up for me like that before, Walter. Nobody." He looked away, embarrassed. "Well, they should. You deserve to be stood up for." And it was in that instant, with that simple sentence hanging in the air between them, that both of them felt their hearts race in a way that was getting harder and harder to pretend was something else. They sat there, quiet, each on their own side of the table, aware that something had shifted but afraid. Both of them afraid to take the first step. She afraid of mistaking gratitude for love. He afraid of looking foolish, afraid that a young woman could never love a worn-down man like him. And so what they felt hung suspended in the air, warm and unspoken, waiting for the right moment. The peace settling over that house still had one more trial to face. One Saturday afternoon, while Walter was mending the fence around the cattle pen and Grace was hanging laundry on the line, an old rattling car came rumbling up the gravel drive, kicking up dust. Grace went cold. She knew that car. Before the engine had even shut off, her heart was already pounding with an old fear. Out of the driver's seat stepped Wade, the man who had vanished the day he found out she was pregnant, the baby's biological father, who now, months later, showed up out of nowhere with the crooked grin of a man who only comes back when he smells an advantage. "Heard you landed on your feet out here," he said, leaning against the car, his eyes sweeping over the farmhouse, the fields, calculating everything. "Living pretty good on the old man's place. You did all right for yourself, huh, Grace?" She froze, one hand pressing the wet laundry to her chest. "What do you want, Wade?" Her voice came out shaking. He shrugged, with a nonchalance that turned her stomach. "Well, the kid's mine too, ain't it? Figured we could work something out. Now that you're sitting pretty, maybe we could come to an understanding." That's when Walter, who had set down his pliers and walked over quietly, stepped up beside Grace, and the air changed. There was no shouting. Walter never needed to shout. He looked the younger man dead in the eye with that hard, weathered calm of a man who'd survived droughts, losses, and his own loneliness, and said, in a voice quieter and sharper than any blade, "That child is hers, and from here on out he's mine too. You had 9 months to show up and you disappeared. Left a pregnant woman out on the road, in the rain, without a dime to her name. A real man doesn't do that." Wade started to fire back some smart remark, but Walter took a step forward, and something in the older man's eyes made him back off. "Get in that car and go, and don't come back. There's nothing here that belongs to you, because what was good you threw it away the second you had it in your hands." Wade tried to save face, muttering something about coming back with a lawyer, about having rights, but his voice had already lost its conviction. Walter didn't so much as flinch. "Bring whoever you want. This door'll be shut to you and open to her always." The younger man slammed his car door, cursing under his breath, and disappeared back down the road in the same cloud of dust he'd arrived in. When the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Grace collapsed into tears that were more relief than fear, and Walter wrapped his arms around her for the first time, without hesitating, pulling her against his chest while she trembled. "Nobody," he murmured into her hair. "Nobody's ever going to hurt you again. Not while I've got breath in me." And Grace, curled into that embrace that smelled of earth and wood smoke, finally understood the difference between the man life had given her and the man life had taken from her. One disappeared in a storm. The other, in a storm, had opened the door. She lifted her tear-streaked face, found his eyes just inches from hers, and for a moment, the whole world stopped. Neither of them kissed the other yet, but in that silence both of them knew it was only a matter of time. The right moment, though, came in a way nobody expected. In the early hours of one morning, with still 5 weeks left until her due date, Grace woke to a sharp pain that made her cry out. Walter, who had slept lightly ever since she'd arrived, ran to her room and found her pale, sweating, curled up in pain on the bed. "The baby," she moaned. "I think the baby's coming, but it's different, Walter. Something's wrong. It hurts too much." His heart lurched with terror. There was no time to lose. He wrapped her in a blanket, lifted her with a strength he didn't know he still had, and carried her out to the old pickup truck. The nearest hospital was 42 minutes away on back roads, and that night, those 42 minutes felt like an eternity. The rain that night seemed to mock him, so much like the storm the night she'd first arrived. The whole drive, with Grace moaning in pain in the passenger seat, Walter kept one hand on the wheel and the other holding hers, talking the entire time, words he didn't even know where they came from, but that needed saying. "Hold on, girl. We're almost there. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, you hear me?" Nothing. And then, in a rush pulled up from somewhere deep in his chest by the fear of losing her, he said what he'd been holding in for weeks. "I don't know what I'd do if I lost you, Grace. I don't know how to live without you in that house, without you in my life anymore. You walked in out of that storm and brought back something I thought died with Margaret. You made me. You made me want to live again." Grace, even through the pain, heard every word and squeezed his hand hard. "Me too, Walter," she managed between contractions. "Me too. Don't let go, okay? Don't let go." They reached the small-town hospital just as the sky was starting to lighten. The nurses rushed Grace inside, and Walter was left pacing the waiting room like a caged animal, his hands shaking, praying for the first time in years. There was a complication. The baby was in a difficult position, and Grace's blood pressure had dropped. For hours, Walter sat suspended between hope and terror, feeling in his bones just how completely, irrevocably, that young woman and the child not yet born were already his family. He who had spent 14 years convinced he was better off alone, now couldn't picture a single day of life without the two of them. He sat down on a hard wooden bench, took off his hat, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, let the tears fall freely. "If you're listening," he murmured, staring up at the ceiling, "don't take her. don't take the baby either. I'll do whatever it takes, but don't take them. When a nurse finally appeared in the doorway, Walter's face tightened with dread, but the woman was smiling. Everything's fine, she said. It was close, but mother and baby are both doing well. It's a boy, you know, strong little fighter, got a set of lungs on him you wouldn't believe. Walter felt his knees go weak and had to steady himself against the wall. A boy. A son. Not his by blood, but his by heart. Of that, he no longer had a single doubt. He walked into the room slowly, his hat crumpled in his hands, and found Grace lying in the bed, exhausted but glowing, a small bundle held close in her arms. She lifted her eyes to him and smiled, the most beautiful smile Walter had ever seen in his life. "Come meet him, Walter," she called softly. "Come meet our boy." And in that word, our, spoken with the most natural ease in the world, Walter understood he had been chosen, that this family wasn't an accident. It was a destiny. He approached carefully, the way a person touches something sacred, and looked down at the small wrinkled red face of the baby. A heavy tear rolled down his sun-worn cheek, and he didn't even try to hide it. "He's beautiful," he murmured. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Grace, her own eyes brimming, held the baby out to him. "Hold him. He's yours as much as he's mine." And Walter, with those enormous, work-hardened hands that had spent a lifetime working the land, cradled that small life with infinite gentleness and felt his heart, the heart he'd locked away for 14 long years, finally break wide open, unguarded, fearless, full of a love too big to hold. Word that closed off Walter Callahan had helped a young woman deliver her baby and was now caring for the both of them like his own family spread through town. And this time, the mean-spirited gossip gave way to shame and then to warmth. The same women who had whispered in that pharmacy line were the first to show up at the farm days later, carrying casseroles, baby clothes, and shame-faced apologies in their eyes. "We talked out of turn, Mr. Callahan," said one of them, a woman named Peggy Sue Watkins, handing over a dish of banana pudding still warm from the oven. "We didn't know the whole story. We're sorry." And Walter, not a man to hold a grudge, simply accepted the dish and said, "Important thing is you know now. And this house is always open to folks who mean well." Miss Peggy, who had a midwife's hands and a grandmother's heart, practically moved in during those first few weeks, teaching Grace how to bathe the baby, how to care for his navel, how to tell apart each kind of cry. Other women took turns bringing over chicken soup, chamomile tea, crocheted blankets. Old Mr. Pruitt from the general store sent over a second-hand baby stroller he'd sanded down and repainted himself. The men who'd once whispered now flagged Walter's truck down on the road, just to offer congratulations and a hand with the harvest. It was as if the whole town, ashamed of having judged, wanted to make up for it with acts of kindness. And the most beautiful part was that Walter, the man who had shut himself off from the world for 14 years, slowly began letting the world back in, discovering that most people, given the chance, are better than he'd let himself remember. Little by little, the farm that had spent 14 years steeped in silence filled up with life. Grace named the baby Henry after Walter's father, because, as she told him with tears in her eyes, "This boy's yours as much as he's mine, and I want him carrying your family's name." Walter had to step out of the kitchen to cry when she said that. The porch that had once only ever seen Walter's chair rocking alone now had diapers drying on the line, pots boiling, people laughing. Duke, the old dog, dragged himself around happily behind everyone, as if he too had gotten younger, and spent hours lying at the foot of the crib, standing guard over little Henry like he was the most precious thing on the whole farm. And in the middle of all that, Walter and Grace found themselves growing closer with every passing day, in gestures, in glances. In the nights they took turns rocking little Henry and ended up falling asleep side by side in the rocking chair, the baby between them, the house finally full. It was on one of those nights, with the baby finally asleep in the crib, in a room that had once been a monument to loss and was now a nest of life, that Walter finally found his courage. They sat together on the porch, looking up at stars burning bright in that clear country sky, the croak of frogs and the song of crickets filling the night, and he took her hand between his. "Grace," he began, his voice shaking more than it had that night at the hospital. "I'm a simple man. Never had much schooling, don't know how to talk pretty, but I know one thing. Since the night you knocked on my door in that storm, my whole life's turned upside down, and in the best way it possibly could. You and Henry are the family I waited my whole life for, and had already given up on ever having." He paused, swallowed hard. "I know I'm a good deal older than you. Know you deserve better. But if you'll have me, I promise to take care of the both of you for as long as I've got breath left in this body." Grace felt her heart swell, but Walter wasn't finished. And what he did next took the ground out from under her. He let go of her hand, rose from the chair, and, bad knee protesting the whole way, knelt down on the porch boards in front of her. From his shirt pocket he pulled a small, simple gold ring he'd bought in secret on his last trip into town, kept hidden for weeks under the mattress, waiting for the courage that had only just now arrived. "Grace, will you marry me? Will you let this stubborn old man spend the rest of his life making you happy?" Grace pressed her hands to her face, and the tears came all at once, but they were tears of a happiness so enormous it ached. "Yes, Walter," she said between sobs, throwing herself into his arms. "Of course I will. You're the best man I have ever known in my whole life. How could I say anything but yes?" And there, on the porch of that farmhouse that had witnessed so much loneliness, under a starlit Tennessee sky, the two of them embraced and kissed for the first time. A long kiss, salted with tears, full of everything both of them had spent a lifetime waiting for without knowing what they were waiting for. From inside the house, as if in approval, came the sleepy little grumble of baby Henry. And the two of them laughed in the middle of the kiss, through tears, like a couple of kids. The wedding took place months later, in the little white church in town, on a sunny Sunday. And it wasn't just any small gathering, though. The whole town turned out. The same people who had once whispered now sat in the pews, dabbing away tears of their own. Grace walked in wearing a simple, beautiful dress, sewn by the hands of the very women who had become her friends. Miss Peggy leading the needle and thread, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers cut from the farm that very morning. And at the altar, in place of the father who had abandoned her, it was old Mr. Pruitt from the general store who walked her down the aisle. Because, as he put it himself, wiping his eyes with a plaid handkerchief, every bride deserves a steady arm to lean on. Walter waited for her up front, in a borrowed suit, hat in his hands, his face wet with tears he didn't even try to hold back. Little Henry in his arms, dressed in a tiny white onesie, taking it all in with those big baby eyes that didn't understand yet, but somehow felt they were surrounded by love. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and told Walter he could kiss the bride, the whole church broke into applause and whistles. And Walter, before kissing Grace, lifted little Henry up for everyone to see, and said loud and clear, his voice breaking but steady, "This here is my son, and this woman is the love of my life. I spent 14 years thinking the Lord had forgotten about me, but he was just saving the best for last." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Outside, under the ringing church bell, the celebration spilled out into the town square. Folding tables loaded with covered dishes every family had brought, fiddle and guitar playing old-time tunes, children running around, and an enormous cake that Miss Peggy had baked from recipes she and Grace now shared. The same town that had once turned its back on a pregnant girl in the rain now celebrated with open hearts the family that same girl had helped bring into being. The years passed, gentle and generous, like the waters of a river finally finding its bed. The farm, once a monument to loneliness, became a byword for life and joy throughout the whole county. Little Henry grew up strong and healthy, running barefoot through the fields, climbing trees, calling Walter Dad, with a naturalness that warmed the heart of everyone who saw it. He learned early to ride, to milk the cows at sunup, to recognize the call of every bird on the property. The whole farm was his playground of adventure. Grace, who had arrived with nowhere to go and no hope left, found not just a home, but a purpose. With Walter's encouragement and her friends' help, she opened a small bakery in town, selling the treats her grandmother had taught her to make: buttermilk biscuits that melted in your mouth, pecan pies, pound cakes that filled the street with the smell of home. The bakery became the gathering place of the whole town, and Grace a source of pride for everyone. And Walter, the man who had padlocked his own heart, learned well into his 50s that it's never too late to start over, to love, to be happy. Not everything was easy. That's the truth, because real life isn't a fairy tale. There were years of drought when the corn barely came in, nights when Henry burned with fever, and the two of them took turns staying up without sleep. Little marriage spats that always got settled in the quiet of an embrace before bed. But between them, there was something most people spend their whole lives searching for and never find. The absolute certainty that no matter what happened, they wouldn't be facing it alone. Walter, who had learned the hard way what loneliness felt like, never once stopped giving thanks every morning for the woman sleeping beside him and the boy who filled the house with noise. And Grace never forgot the night when, soaked through and out of hope, a door opened for her in the middle of nowhere. One Sunday morning, many years after that stormy night, Walter woke early, as he always did, and went out to the porch with his coffee. He sat down in the old rocking chair, the same one that had once creaked alone in a shut-up room, and watched the sun rise over the ridgeline, painting the fields gold. From inside the house came the smell of something baking, Grace humming an old tune, the laughter of Henry, taller now, chasing the chickens around the yard. Duke had passed on a few years back, old age catching up with him, buried under the maple tree he'd always loved best, and another dog, a puppy Henry had adopted, now ran in his place. Walter breathed in that clean morning air, thick with the smell of earth and coffee, and felt his eyes well with an overwhelming gratitude. He looked toward the door of the house, that same door he had once hesitated so long to open, and smiled. Just then, Grace appeared in the doorway, with a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, and handed it to him with a kiss on the forehead. "Morning, my old man," she said, the same warmth in her voice as always, wearing the same cheap lavender perfume he still brought her from town. She sat down on the arm of the chair, and the two of them sat there in silence, watching their son play in the sun-drenched yard. And Walter thought, his heart overflowing, about how one single decision, the decision to open a door on a stormy night when everything inside him screamed to keep it shut, had completely transformed his life. He had opened that door thinking he was saving a stranger from the rain, but the truth was, it was him who ended up saved. The three of them really had saved each other, because family, Walter finally understood, isn't a matter of blood. It's a matter of choice. It's who stays. It's who, on a stormy night, decides to open the door of their heart and let love walk in. If this story touched your heart in any way, type a single word in the comments: family. I want to see how many people this story reaches today. Now tell me, which moment moved you the most? Was it when Walter decided to open that door on the stormy night? When he stood up for Grace and sent Wade packing off the farm? Or when he got down on one knee on that porch and asked her to marry him? And don't forget to tell me what town you're watching from. I've gotten comments from all across the country, and it moves me every single time. If you believe it's never too late to start over, and that true love finds you when you least expect it, hit that like button on this video. If you know somebody who needs to hear that life still has beautiful surprises in store, share this story with them. And if you want more stories that restore your faith in humanity, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of your heart.